The full extent of Lalaurie's crimes was revealed on April 10, 1834, when a fire broke out at her mansion. When neighbors arrived to help, they found something disturbing. Lalaurie was trying to save her jewels and furs without any assistance from her slaves. When asked where her servants were, she told everyone to mind their own business. Some neighbors heard faint moans and screams from the attic. When rescuers broke into the attic, they discovered what can only be described as a torture chamber. They found enslaved people who had been subjected to horrific medical experiments, mutilation, and prolonged torture. Bodies were discovered with bones broken and reset in grotesque positions to make victims look like crabs or caterpillars. Others had their eyes gouged out, fingernails torn off, ears hanging by shreds of skin, or mouths filled with excrement and sewn shut. Many had flayed skin and festering wounds, with some reportedly still alive despite their condition. The scene was so horrific that witnesses vomited from the stench and sight. Accounts describe metal bars with spikes wrapped around slaves' necks to prevent head movement, people crammed in small cages, and victims with their intestines torn out and knotted around their waists. Funeral registers document the deaths of 12 slaves at the mansion between 1830 and 1834, though the causes were never officially recorded. An elderly cook, chained to the stove and slowly starving, had started the fire in a suicide attempt rather than face more torture. She revealed that Lalaurie had threatened to take her to the top room, a place from which no slave ever returned. Lalaurie and her husband fled by boat before they could be arrested, leaving their butler to face the angry crowd that stormed the mansion. Although charges were never filed, her reputation in upper-class society was destroyed. She reportedly died in Paris in December 1842. But extreme cases like Lalaurie's should not overshadow the more common forms of violence that white women routinely inflicted. Whipping was standard practice for minor offenses. White women would beat enslaved people with switches, canes, or specialized instruments designed to inflict maximum pain. The psychological abuse was just as damaging, involving deliberate humiliation, threats against family members, and emotional torture designed to break spirits along with bodies. The most disturbing aspect of this history is how systematically it has been hidden and suppressed. For more than 150 years, historians, writers, and cultural commentators have conspired to erase evidence of white women's active participation in slavery's worst abuses. This suppression served multiple purposes. It protected the image of white femininity that was central to Southern identity and mythology. It simplified the narrative of slavery by focusing primarily on white male perpetrators and black female victims. And it avoided the uncomfortable reality that oppression can be perpetrated by those who are themselves oppressed in other ways. The voices of enslaved people who tried to tell these stories were systematically discredited and dismissed. When formerly enslaved people spoke about abuse by white women, their accounts were labeled as unreliable, biased, or motivated by revenge. White historians argued that enslaved people could not be trusted to provide accurate testimony about their own experiences. This dismissal was particularly pronounced regarding accounts of sexual abuse by white women. The combination of racial prejudice and gender assumptions made it almost impossible for these stories to be believed. The idea that white women could be sexual predators was simply too threatening to prevailing social beliefs. Even when evidence was overwhelming, it was reinterpreted to protect white women's reputations. Cases of clear abuse were explained away as exceptional circumstances, mental illness, or the influence of cruel husbands. The systematic nature of white women's participation was hidden by treating each case as isolated, rather than part of a broader pattern. The myth of the genteel Southern lady became a powerful tool for suppressing these stories. This idealized image portrayed white women as naturally kind, gentle, and morally superior to men. Any evidence contradicting this image was dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. The reality of white women's cruelty was literally unthinkable within this mythological framework. Legal systems contributed to this suppression. Courts were reluctant to prosecute white women for crimes against enslaved people, and when they did, penalties were minimal. Marie Delphine Lalaurie escaped consequences entirely despite overwhelming evidence of torture and murder. Popular culture reinforced these silences through stories like Gone with the Wind that romanticized slavery and portrayed white women as victims rather than perpetrators. These cultural products, created decades after slavery ended, actively worked to rewrite history and erase evidence of white women's participation in slavery's abuses. The suppression of enslaved people's testimonies was enforced by the same system that made abuse possible. Enslaved people who spoke out faced severe consequences, while white women's reputations remained protected by social conventions. This created a conspiracy of silence that has persisted for generations. However, despite systematic suppression, some enslaved people managed to document and preserve accounts of abuse by white women. These testimonies, found in slave narratives, court records, and interviews conducted decades after emancipation, provide crucial evidence of experiences that white society worked hard to hide. Harriet Jacobs, in her groundbreaking autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, documented multiple instances of white women's sexual and physical abuse. She wrote about plantation mistresses who forced themselves on male slaves and daughters of planters who selected the most brutalized enslaved men as sexual targets specifically because her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. Jacobs also described a male slave named Luke, who was kept chained at his master's bedside and forced to provide sexual services. She revealed that Luke was only allowed to wear a shirt during the day, so he could be easily accessed and severely punished if he resisted his master's advances. The formerly enslaved people who spoke to Works Progress Administration interviewers in the 1930s showed remarkable courage in sharing their experiences. Many were elderly and vulnerable, living in communities where white supremacy remained powerful and violent. Yet they chose to tell their stories, preserving crucial evidence of experiences that white society preferred to forget. These testimonies reveal that enslaved communities developed informal networks for sharing information about particularly dangerous white women. They would warn each other about which mistresses were most likely to inflict violence, which ones made false accusations, and which ones were sexually predatory. This knowledge sharing was a form of collective protection in a system designed to keep enslaved people isolated and vulnerable. The resistance shown by enslaved people in these situations was remarkable given the extreme power imbalances they faced. Some found ways to avoid or minimize contact with abusive white women. Others developed strategies for deflecting violence or redirecting anger toward less vulnerable targets. Many simply endured, finding ways to maintain their humanity and dignity despite constant dehumanization. The resilience required to survive this abuse was extraordinary. Enslaved people had to maintain their sense of self-worth while being constantly told they were property. They had to protect their family relationships while living under people who could destroy those relationships at will. They had to find ways to resist without triggering deadly retaliation. However, understanding white women's role in slavery requires examining how different forms of oppression and privilege intersected in complex and contradictory ways. White women in the antebellum South were simultaneously oppressed as women and privileged as white people and slave owners. This intersection created unique opportunities for both victimization and perpetration. White women's limited legal rights and social freedoms meant they had fewer outlets for power and control than white men. But their ownership of enslaved people gave them an alternative avenue for exercising dominance and authority. Many white women seemed to genuinely enjoy the power they held over enslaved people. They relished their ability to command absolute obedience, to inflict punishment for perceived slights, and to control every aspect of another person's life. White women's supposed weakness and vulnerability also became weapons in the slave system. They could claim to be threatened by enslaved people who resisted their commands, knowing that white men would respond with violence to protect white female honor. They could make false accusations of assault or insubordination, knowing these would be believed without question. The sexual dimensions of this power were particularly complex. White women were expected to be sexually pure and passive, but they could exercise sexual dominance over enslaved people with relative impunity. This allowed them to transgress normal gender boundaries while maintaining their social status and reputation. The intersection of race and gender also created specific vulnerabilities for enslaved people. Enslaved men had no protection against sexual abuse by white women because the legal and social system could not conceive of white women as sexual aggressors. Enslaved women had no protection against white women's violence because female violence was seen as less serious than male violence. Some scholars have suggested that white women's cruelty was displaced aggression, that they took out frustrations about their own oppression on enslaved people. While this may explain some individual cases, it does not excuse the systematic nature of their participation or diminish their moral responsibility. The reality is that oppression in one dimension does not prevent someone from being an oppressor in another. White women's experience of gender-based oppression did not make them natural allies of enslaved people. Instead, many use their limited power to participate enthusiastically in an even more brutal system of racial oppression. The systematic suppression of this history has had lasting consequences that extend far beyond academic debates. By refusing to acknowledge white women's active participation in slavery, American society has maintained comfortable myths about gender, race, and power that continue to shape contemporary attitudes and binary policies. The myth of white female innocence remains powerful in American culture. This myth makes it difficult to recognize or address instances where white women participate in racial oppression today. It creates blind spots that allow harmful behaviors to continue unchallenged because they don't fit expected patterns of how oppression works. Educational systems continue to maintain these silences. Textbooks, curricula, and teaching materials present slavery primarily as a conflict between white men and enslaved people, with white women portrayed mainly as background figures or fellow victims of patriarchal oppression. This incomplete narrative prevents students from understanding the full complexity of how slavery functioned. The failure to acknowledge white women's participation in slavery's abuses has made it easier to dismiss claims about contemporary racial discrimination by white women. It has created unrealistic expectations about who can be trusted to address racial inequality and who is likely to perpetuate it. This history demonstrates the importance of listening to marginalized voices and taking their experiences seriously. The systematic dismissal of enslaved people's testimonies about white women's abuse shows how power structures work to silence inconvenient truths. This pattern continues today when victims of abuse struggle to be believed, especially when their abusers hold positions of social respectability. However, confronting this hidden history is essential for several reasons. It provides a more complete and accurate understanding of how slavery functioned as a system of oppression. We cannot fully comprehend the institution's violence and dehumanization if we ignore the participation of nearly half of all slave owners. This history also helps us understand how different forms of oppression and privilege intersect in complex ways. The example of white women in slavery shows that being oppressed in one dimension does not prevent someone from being an oppressor in another. This understanding is crucial for addressing contemporary forms of inequality that operate along multiple axes of difference. By acknowledging this history helps us recognize patterns of violence and abuse that continue today. The strategies white women use to exploit and control enslaved people, psychological manipulation, false accusations, economic coercion, and sexual predation, remain common tools of oppression in various forms. The voices of enslaved people who tried to tell these stories deserve to be heard and believed. Their testimonies provide crucial evidence about experiences that white society worked hard to hide. Their courage in preserving and sharing these accounts despite enormous risks represents a form of resistance that continues to challenge historical silences. The history we have explored today challenges every comfortable assumption about slavery, gender, and power in American history. It reveals that the institution of slavery was even more pervasive, more brutal, and more psychologically damaging than commonly understood. It shows that nearly half of all slave owners were women who actively participated in buying, selling, torturing, and sexually exploiting the people they owned. This history has been systematically suppressed because it threatens mythologies that remain central to American identity. The image of the genteel Southern lady, the assumption that women are naturally less violent than men, and the belief that oppressed groups cannot also be oppressors. All of these comfortable beliefs crumble when confronted with the evidence of white women's participation in slavery's worst abuses. Confronting uncomfortable truths is essential for understanding how systems of oppression actually function. Slavery was not the product of individual cruelty or regional culture. It was a sophisticated economic and social system that required the active participation of millions of people, including those who might seem unlikely perpetrators. Most importantly, this history demonstrates why we must always listen carefully to the voices of those who have been marginalized and oppressed. The systematic dismissal of enslaved people's testimonies about white women's abuse shows how power structures work to silence inconvenient truths. This pattern continues today in various forms, making it essential that we learn to recognize and challenge these silencing mechanisms. The hidden history of white women's participation in slavery offers no simple lessons or easy answers. But it does provide essential insights into how oppression functions, how historical narratives are constructed and maintained, and why confronting uncomfortable truths is necessary for genuine progress toward justice and equality. By breaking the silence around this history, we honor the experiences of those who suffered abuse and exploitation. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Only by facing the full scope of historical wrongs can we begin to understand how they continue to shape our present and work effectively to create a more just future. The systematic participation of white women in slavery's abuses reminds us that oppression is not about individual prejudice or hatred, but about systems of power that can corrupt anyone who benefits from them, regardless of their other identities or experiences. This history challenges us to look beyond simple categories of victim and perpetrator, to understand the complex ways that privilege and oppression intersect, and to recognize that the fight for justice requires constant vigilance against the corrupting influence of power in all its forms. We have uncovered some uncomfortable truths today, but facing them head-on is how we build a better future. What surprised you the most? Do you think the women were more wicked than the men? What are your thoughts on these untold stories? Drop them in the comments below. If this video opened your eyes, show your support by smashing that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribing for more eye-opening content. Uncovering truth is just the start.